Ryan Manley, thank you for the $5 super chat. What's your theory for why games across the board are taking so much longer to make than back in the early 2000s, early 2010s when they were flying out? I think there's a few pillars of it. I think this is a good question. What's a solid game? Well, like maybe we look at Fallout New Vegas or something. Oh yeah, these old school IGN reviews, man. Look at that when they had this weird robotic thing. Oh, this is a throwback. But if the question is why are games taking so much longer and so much more manpower and money to make today than they were back then, there's the obvious factors such as, inflationary pressures that make it more expensive to compensate people, where it's now a matter of some people are basically making twice what they were before in terms of actual dollars, even though the purchasing power of those dollars is not the same as it was 20 years ago. So people are pretty much the same spot they were, if not a little worse. But that's why the budget number might just be bigger. Proportional to where we were back then, it might be closer, but still. Like, for example, The Witcher 3 cost $80 million to make is the number I saw. 80 million. That apparently is in line with the same rough cost of making the Mass Effect Andromeda, for example. It was like somewhere between 50, 60, and $80 million for Andromeda. Nowadays, those games would be 200 to 300 million. And there's inflationary pressure, sure, but also I think there's a lot of added costs involved with modern video game production, where the teams are a lot bigger because the quality level has gone up with pretty much every aspect. So in something like Fallout New Vegas, the reason I pulled this up is because Fallout New Vegas is an example of why games could have been made so quickly back in 2010. Look at this landscape. We have extremely simple architecture in terms of actual buildings. The land masses are extremely simple. The big boulders you see over here are just scaled up versions of the smaller rocks you find around the map. They're just stretched and are bigger. But in the age of 2010, you could get away with that. It wasn't that big of a deal, and gamers were just kind of used to it. That the texture on this rock doesn't look very good. If you had a texture on a rock that looked like this nowadays, people would crucify you. I mean, it would be totally unacceptable. But back in 2010, it was okay to have this much empty space, where you can see there's a few rocks plopped around here, but one artist could probably create this layout, this area of the map, everything you see, and place everything within a day, pretty easy, pretty comfortably. And when you factor in that this was made with reused assets predominantly from Fallout 3, it was a very iterative process, which is why they could pump this game out in 18 months. But there's not a whole lot of wildly impressive detail or complexity here. It's a lot of the same items repeated over and over and over again. The maps and levels are comparatively quite small, and the quality of individual assets are lower and all of that. So I think that's one reason why studios were able to pump stuff out so freaking fast compared to how they do it nowadays. And it's because I think standards were lower because technology was weaker. But also, I think in the same vein, people were more willing to put up with shorter stories for $60 basically. They were willing to put up with smaller scope for $60. And I actually do think that they still are willing to pay $60-$70 for a smaller in scope game. I think Space Marine 2 is a phenomenal example where it's a 10-ish hour campaign that's $60, but they add in a multiplayer mode and some other stuff. It's basically a 360 game, but with a 2024 coat of paint on it in a good way. And I think it proves that people are willing to spend full price basically, but for smaller scope games, so long as the quality is high. The difference back in 2010, 2009, 2008 is that you could have shorter scope games and the quality was high for the time, but the difference is the quality standards for 2024 are way higher than they were in 2008 because the technology has improved and things like that. There's also no doubt a lot of corporate bloat that goes into this. A lot of the teams that put these games together are huge and perhaps unnecessarily so. I think Call of Duty is a great example. I read a really interesting breakdown from an investor in Activision Blizzard before they were bought out by Microsoft, and he basically was arguing that the company was undervalued because in his opinion the staff could be cut by 20, 30, 40%, and the same quality and same quantity of content could be produced for their current catalog. He's like, they have way too many employees for what they're putting out. Way too many employees. We could cut a lot of jobs, a lot of teams, and do the same amount of work. It's like when Elon Musk walked into Twitter headquarters and fired something like 70% of the staff. And X is literally, in terms of users, bigger than it ever has been, and he cut 70% of the workforce. So I think there is perhaps some bloat in terms of like the bureaucratic way that things are set up, where, we've talked about the difficulties with how like BGS, for example, has run, where people are like, why is it so bloated? Why does it take so long for them to do kind of more basic things? And it's because you can have a team over here, a team over here, a team over here, a team over here. And each of these is specialized in different things. So you could have, maybe this is the original writers that come up with like the design for the quest. And then they send that concept to the environmental builders, the set builders, the guys that actually make the levels. And then they go in here after they designed the level, they pass it off to the texturing crew that makes all the materials, makes everything look really, really good and pretty. And so they finish their work. They send it off to the lighting team, and the lighting team then hands it off to the animators, who are going to take in the NPCs and get them placed and get them doing what they need to do. But oh no, they just figured out the scene isn't set up right. We actually need it arranged this other way, because the NPCs, they can't stand at the bar the way it's set up right now. So then they have to send it all the way back here, and they have to fix it. And then it goes back through, and maybe now it passes, they do their work, and it passes forward to the final like cinematics team. But the cinematics team realizes, oh God, you have a bookshelf here where the camera needs to go. You need to remove the bookshelf. So they send it all the way back here, and then they send it, after they remove the bookshelf, all the way back through the pipeline, and it lands back here. And after they give it the go ahead, it passes all the way through. So you have a ton of bloat and wasted time where you're going back all the way through the process multiple times, I would argue, unnecessarily so. And this is how like a lot of companies nowadays work, where it's super, super bloated based on the departments. What CD Projekt Red did is that each of these is like color coded, right? You have different like colors for each team, if we just say that, right? And they just put teams where they have one person or two people or whatever you want to say from each team working on this in an individual team. So you just build a team with those people. And so all of this is removed. You don't have to deal with all these extra hurdles and bubbles and certifications and getting one person to sign off on it, one person to give the go ahead, and then it has to go all the way back through, and then this other person has to give their signature for it, and blah, 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 blah. Instead, you can just have one team that has each discipline represented, and they just make the whole level. And when they need something, they just talk to Tim. And then when Tim needs something, they talk to Rachel. And when Rachel needs something, she passes it off to Luke, and Luke fixes it, and they can just get it done really, really quickly. So I think that there's multiple things that go into it, but I think there's a mixture of higher quality standards on individual things like assets, animation quality. The demand is much higher now. Expectations for like motion capture are present when that wasn't really a thing here. I mean, all of the NPCs walked with kind of these dynamic animations that everybody else used, and it was, by modern standards, extremely poor. Whereas now the expectation is that it's much higher effort and higher production value. Same with voice acting, same with everything else that goes into it. So standards are way higher. Budgets are higher because it's more expensive just to pay for people to live nowadays. And then also, I think there's a lot of corporate inefficiency present at a lot of these bigger studios that is a result of the companies slowly expanding without having moments of real reflection where they go and trim the fat and reorganize and make sure that everything is working as efficiently as it can. So it's a good question. I think there's just a lot of compounding reasons, Yeah, agile methodology. Yeah, Andrew Cohorn, the last team in the line, saying F it, it's fine, might be why the bugs get through. Yeah, well, and even just if you think of it this way, like with this setup, after all of these headaches, each time this happens, time is being burned, right? And time is literally money because you're paying for people's salaries. But each time you have to send something back, that is expensive in time and money. And eventually, the big wigs in the corporate office, what happens? They get really frustrated. Things are taking so long. So what do? They say, well, you have to get this done. You have to get, maybe you just have different little projects. You got different little scenes, and maybe there's bigger encounters and bigger levels, and there's a bunch of like little bitty ones. But you have to get all of these through this process within a year. It has to get all the way through. And some of them go through and they get here, and then they get sent back, and then they go through again, and they make it a little further, and then they get sent back over here, and then they go through, and then they get sent back here because something went wrong, and then they get approved and they get put in the game. Eventually they run out of time and they have to start just sending stuff. So this one, it goes through, and maybe they send it back here for review and for fixing something, but then they get back to here and they realize they need to send it back again, but they don't have time. So they send it forward anyways. And they're like, we're going to send it through, get it to where it needs to be to at least function, hopefully. And if we have time at the end of development for patches or something, we can fix it then, which a lot of game studios handle things that way. That's fine. But what you'll see is that there's going to be a lot of times where that doesn't happen. And that's how you end up with bugs and glitches and broken stuff, where it's just like, how did this make it through QA? Like, how on earth did they think that's okay? Then there's other cases where it just literally makes no sense. In the Starfield video I just put up like a few minutes ago on the big channel, that gun still doesn't reload from the paid mod. It still doesn't reload in first person. If you swap to third person, the gun reloads. If you stay in first person, it won't reload. And that's a $7 quest to get that gun. It doesn't make any sense. It's baffling, but that's months after that quest was dropped, right? For that, like, how does that happen? I don't even know. With BGS, that's why it's so confusing. Because you would think they'd get to maybe here, and then they realize, hey, the gun doesn't reload. And they'd send it back to like a programmer to fix it, and then it passes back through and they fix it. For BGS, they seemingly just like sent it in here. It went through the pipeline. They sold it for $7. And because they already released it, they literally just don't care enough to fix it. So they're just not going to touch it again. It's been months and it still is broken. It's still broken. The Astrobot folks said they use the same approach as Phantom Liberty, which is another showcase of the benefits to that approach. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that it works more efficiently than the big corporate structure. The big corporate structure is beneficial for some workloads and for some types of stuff where multiple layers of approvals are useful. So think like legal stuff or like when I worked in corporate real estate, when we would have a listing, we would go through and we would have like the marketing guy look at it, and they would go and check it out, and then they go through here, and then they go through there, and there were many, many layers of approvals, but it's because we didn't want to get into a situation where we were posting something and then like accidentally revealing wrong information that causes people to lose hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, right? So in some fields, I think it makes sense to have that bureaucracy, right? To slow things down so that we really get it right, hopefully. The problem with a lot of these companies, though, is they're slowing it down and they're still not getting it right. He took my thing.